bring life actually brought death. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment, put me to death. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. Nevertheless, in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it used what is good to bring about my death, so that through the commandment, sin might become utterly sinful. Any thoughts about what Paul says there?
That he was okay until the law put a light on what was wrong.
Right, okay.
And then all of a sudden he wanted to do his body wanted to do all the wrong things. Just
Okay.
because the light was on.
Right, right. It's interesting to me that what he says, if you pay close attention, is that he says before the law, sin was dead. But when the law came into being, sin sprang to life. And he died. Okay? Now he had said that sin was dead apart from the law, and he was alive. So when the law comes into being, Paul basically says that the situation completely turns around. Sin springs to life, and he dies. So we got to be real careful looking at the language that Paul uses here to understand exactly what he's saying and understand the points that he's trying to get across when it comes to the law. But it's pretty clear that Paul seems to have a struggle even understanding and trying to explain what he means. Daryl, were you going to say something? No? Okay. Sorry. So I mentioned this a couple of times before, but interestingly, this chapter and this section of this chapter is where Paul kind of suddenly switches to a first-person language here, okay? Before this, he'd been using third person, and he had been talking primarily to his readers, okay? And he said, you need to understand this. You do this. And then he comes in chapter 7, and he says, now, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. So there's been different perspectives on what Paul is doing here. And some of those perspectives have been that theologians think, well, Paul can't possibly be talking to believers here because there's a contradiction kind of in what he's saying, because he just finished a whole chapter on saying that we're free from sin, and now he's talking about that he's been impacted by sin and still struggles with sin, and so how can that be? So different theologians have proposed that maybe what he's doing here is that he's kind of putting himself into the place of an unconverted person, okay? Somebody who's still seeking what's right and what's righteous, but he's being misled, deceived by sin, and that the law has a part in that. And there's various other interpretations too, okay? But the commentator that I'm using mostly for this study, and who I think has a really good perspective on Romans overall, says, you just kind of got to take Paul at his word here. Paul has a personal struggle with what's going on here, and he wants everybody to understand that this is something that we all will struggle with even in our Christian life. Okay, so I guess you have to decide which perspective is the one that you feel like is best, but that's the perspective that I'm going to kind of teach from. So when he has this first person language now, I want you to think from the perspective I'm going to teach at least, is that this is Paul struggling internally within himself over the things that he's saying and writing, okay? So this commentator that I'm using says, the commandment confronts man with its command, you shall not covet. But what is the result? Not that covetousness vanishes, but on the contrary, it's brought out of seclusion. So he says, in conclusion, it is in relation to the law that sin grows powerful in man. This is perfectly in alignment with what Paul said, because what Paul said was that prior to the law, sin was dead to him. And he said, I wouldn't have even known really what covetousness was unless the law said you shouldn't do it. Okay, and then once the law says you shouldn't do it and kind of defines what it is, now he's entirely aware of what it is, right? And now he has to fight against it because sin is also entirely aware of the law and what the law forbids. So sin is going to take every advantage that it can to try to get believers to get involved in sin. Okay? So there's this struggle going on all the time, and this is another one of those times when Paul's using this dichotomy, these two opposing kinds of thoughts, and we're going to see, as he gets into this, we'll see what that leads to. Now, I've showed this slide a few times, but I added some graphics here to show. Paul, in the past, has made it very clear that out of all these powers that seem to influence us on a day-to-day basis, he's made it clear that sin and death are destructive powers. Okay, so I added the little explosion there. Those are clearly destructive powers. But what does he say about the law? Well, we have to look at what he says about the law because it's a little confusing the way he says it. It seems to be involved somehow in, it seems to be in relation to these destructive powers. But on the other hand, Paul said it is holy and righteous. So we got to figure out exactly, what Paul is saying here. So he starts out this discussion of the nature of the law with one of his rhetorical questions. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? So he says, certainly not. Okay? So right away, I think he wants to establish that the law itself is not sinful. Because a lot of what he has just said is that somehow or another, sin and the law are very closely related. But he says right away, the law itself is not sinful. Right? But I wouldn't have known what sin was if it hadn't been for the law. All right, so there's some interplay going on here. Now, the commentator that I'm using says, it is not, by nature and original purpose, a power of destruction, the law. Okay? Its primary aim is to make man responsive to the will of God. But in actual fact, it becomes a power that destroys because sin finds opportunity through it. Now, part of what Paul is trying to do here for his believers is to make sure that they understand the role of the law and its place in our lives, and to make sure that his readers don't fall into a trap again of going back to the law. Okay? So this question comes up then, and this commentator says it this way. Since the law is the document that expresses God's will, under which the Christian would and must live, the question arises, does that not mean that the life of the Christian is and must be under the law? So this is one of the questions that Paul is trying to convey, and one of the nature of the law that he's trying to get across is you have to be very careful about where you put your faith. Okay, because remember that our theme is that it is through righteousness that comes by faith that we shall live. All right? So when we're talking about the law versus faith, those are the two things where Paul's struggle is in placing his faith. Because for many, many years, generations, the Jewish community has placed their faith in having the law and knowing the law. Rhonda?
Yeah, I don't want to sidebar, but it seems to me like what he's saying is you can be a Christian, but you're not perfect. And so you still have these guidelines to follow, but they don't rule you. You have your faith that gets you over, but you're still going to mess up because becoming a Christian doesn't make you Jesus, doesn't make you perfect. You still are human and you still are subject to sin.
Yes.
You're still a sinner. You're a Christian. you're a sinner. You're righteous, but you're a sinner.
Yeah.
And so you're still going to do this, and so you're still going to see it. And the other thing that I'm thinking is, in the classroom, we make rules that are positive things to do. Mm-hmm. Respect one another, not don't treat your neighbor cruddily.
Right. Right.
So we like, but the Ten Commandments are not written with those positive things in there. They're, thou shalt not.
Right. Oh, okay.
And so the focus becomes what I can't do, and not on what I'm supposed to do.
Right. Right.
And so it seems like that's what he's saying, but like you can't satisfy the law. You need Jesus to get through that, because you are going to mess up. You need your faith to understand that God knows you. That's why he put that there, to let you know when you need to repent.
Yes. Okay. All right. That's a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure I can summarize what you said. But yeah, no, all good comments. I saw Jim and I don't know, another hand.
I can't help but think of what Jesus said about adultery. And then he said, when you look at a woman with lustful eyes, you commit adultery. So you have the letter of the law when you actually commit adultery, and then you have the concept that we're talking about here, when you commit adultery in your heart. So you have the law, and then you have the application in the spirit.
Ah, okay. All right. No, that's a good point too, and I think that's part of what Paul struggles with too, because he talks a little bit later in the next section we're going to get into. He talks about that the things he wants to do, he doesn't do, and the things he doesn't want to do, he ends up doing. And so we'll see that struggle in a few minutes. Yes, Melinda?
Perhaps what I got out of it when I read it was that by putting our faith in Jesus, that enables us to live the law. We can't do it on our own. We can't do it. It's Jesus' righteousness that we need to live the way God wants us to. Not just like the letter of the law, not committing adultery, but not having in your heart that you would want to behave that way. It's the righteousness of Jesus that enables us to live the law.
Okay. So that is one of the perspectives also that theologians over the years have proposed, is what Paul means here, is that because we now have the righteousness that comes from God, that he has enabled us to live out the law. Now, the only problem with that is that we still violate the law, okay? But I know exactly what you mean, and I think the emphasis on what you're saying is that our righteousness comes through God, or from God through Christ, all right, and not through following the law. And it wasn't even actually God's intent that once we receive righteousness through Christ, that we somehow are able to execute the law flawlessly, okay? Because we're not. There's a constant struggle going on, and that's part of what Paul brings up here, is that just because Christ introduced a new aeon that we've been referring to it, a new life that began with him, we haven't escaped yet the dominion that Adam started when he first sinned and brought sin into the world. Okay, that existence, that dominion is still on the earth, right? It's still happening, and that's where Paul's struggle is trying to live in those two different dominions, and the battle that constantly goes on there. Okay, so again, part of the point that he's trying to make here, he's trying to discourage his readers from ultimately going back to the law. And when I say going back to the law, I mean putting their faith in executing the law. Because the righteousness that we received from God through Christ was not a law enabler. Okay, Paul's trying to get across the point here. We're free from the law. We're free from it. Don't go back. And I'm going to show you actually. Let me just go to Galatians chapter 5. Paul and other apostles have had to address various Christian communities in the first century about the law. And Paul says to the Galatians here, and we've used this verse before, it is for freedom that Christ set us free. So stand firm then. Don't let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. if you look at that in context, what he's talking about is the law. He's saying, don't go back to the law. Don't assume that now that you have righteousness that comes through Christ, that you can somehow live by the law, and that when it comes Judgment Day, that you have the ability somehow to stand before God and say, well, ever since I put on Christ, I've executed the law perfectly. That is not what you want to be able to present to God at judgment. What you want to say to God at judgment is, I have your righteousness that came through your Son Jesus, and that's what I'm relying on right now, right? Because for you to say that, or for you to be convinced somehow that the righteousness of God that came through Christ has enabled you to fulfill the law, that's the wrong way to interpret this, okay? And that's a lot of what Paul is trying to say here. Don't go back to the law as your source of salvation. It's not there. Any other thoughts on it? Yeah, John.
I think it'd be hard for these people. This is like 57 AD, I think is what they're saying in Romans,
Yep.
right? So, some of these people, it's like 25 years removed from Jesus' resurrection, if you will, and your generations, your grandparents, their great-grandparents, all of that was not through a faith in a person or even that is God. And so it would be really hard in my mind to just say, hey, all the things you've ever heard and grown up from, all your traditions and everything, it's really a belief in this one person resurrected that happened 25 years ago that your whole group of people thought was going to come back eminently, and he hasn't. And so you just, the law is not how you get there like everybody thought for so many years. It's a huge transition, I would think, for these people to continuously hear this, even if they hear it more than once. It would be really hard to break those generational changes so close to when they saw that Jesus was able to forgive all these people as soon as it's done, theoretically, and transition their life. We've had generations to get used to that, and they didn't.
Right. So, I mean, John, I was trying to think this week of some sort of an analogy that I could use that might shed a little bit of light on this for us. And it was tricky. Now, Spirit brought this, I guess, allegory or analogy to mind, and it probably pales in comparison to what Paul is saying here. But think for a minute about we as citizens have pledged our allegiance. When I say pledge our allegiance, what comes to mind? The pledge, right? The Pledge of Allegiance. We've repeated that over and over and over as American citizens, right? So we have pledged our allegiance to the flag and the country through this memorization of this phrase, okay, the Pledge of Allegiance. Suppose now that somebody came along in our society, somebody that had a small following, okay, but that society in general sort of questioned and, kind of thought, I'm not so sure about that, but that person came along and taught that the Pledge of Allegiance, even though in its verbiage, in its writing, in its intent and everything is good, but that somehow there was an evil influence that was using the pledge against what it stood for, and tried to teach that. How hard would it be to convince yourself that after years and years of saying the Pledge of Allegiance and looking at everything that's in it and thinking, I don't see any issue with what's written here, it all seems good and righteous, so to speak, but now there's somebody who's saying that there is this power using this against me to undermine actually what it itself stands for. And that's the closest allegory I could come up with to what Paul is saying about the law and how they may interpret what he's saying about this thing that they have put their faith and trust in for generations. There were generations of my family before I existed who pledged allegiance to the flag, right? There's a heritage there. So this is hard teaching. And this is partly why I think Paul also has such a struggle when he's talking about this particular topic, because it is something that he really wanted to hold on to too, and he has said that. So I don't know if that helps you maybe understand a little bit about the emotion and the struggle that there might be here, and that I'm sure that Paul understands better than anybody, and that is part of what he is trying to express to his readers here, is, I know there's this thing that you grew up with and that you put your faith in, but you have to realize that sin is using that against you, okay? Even though he says, it is in itself good, it's holy and righteous, but sin is using it against you. And that's a hard concept to get across, and it's hard even for Paul. So I wanted to kind of show this graphically maybe, to simplify it a little bit here. So basically, with part of what Paul is trying to say here is that with the unconverted man, sin works with the law and it produces death. Okay? Now Paul writes this rhetorical question that he's trying to deal now with those who would believe that now that I am free from sin, shouldn't the law be a guide, a counsel to me as I strive for life? And what Paul is saying is, don't let sin convince you of that. Remember when we talked a little bit about sin, when sin is on the throne of your life, it convinces you that you are in control. Okay? When in effect, it is in control over you. Okay? So if sin can get the converted man, the man who has received righteousness from God, if sin can get that man to be convinced that he can now return to the law and use the law as a guide for his salvation, then he has you again. He has executed a deceit that is going to undermine your faith. Okay, and that's part of what Paul is trying to explain in these several verses here. So Paul says, the law is not able to call forth in your life, is not able to call forth good, and it is not able to lead you to life. Right? Now that is not to say that what is in the law is not good. It's just that the law itself is unable to call forth good in your life. Okay? Because there's too strong of a power working against it and working against you. So this next section of Scripture is going to be where Paul tries to convey that thinking. Okay, so we're going to go to chapter 7, verses 14 through 25 here. I'll pause and make sure there's no comments before we jump into this section. Anybody have anything?
Well, I was thinking something.
Go ahead.
Paul was crucifying Christians before he had his conversion.
Mhm.
But he thought he was following the law.
Yes.
And so now he has this in front of, like, what I was doing was wrong. And very wrong. Because it was shown to me in a very big way.
Yep.
And now I'm trying to tell you that this is wrong in a very big way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that I'm just looking at where, like, Paul is trying to tell these people. And do they know that he was crucifying Christians before stopping them?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure they knew that. He had a reputation that he had to undo. Yes, yeah. So for sure they knew about his past. Okay, and that may be part of what he's struggling with here, is even dealing with his past. Because one of those things that sin does is it tries to convince you that there's no power of love strong enough to forgive that, right? I mean, you did some heinous things, and it tries to convince you that it still has its grip on you.
And you might be converting me so then you can kill me? Is that, I mean, like, thinking that?
I'm sure there was a huge spectrum of thoughts when Paul came into a city, right? So let's take a look at these scripture here. So Paul goes on to say, we know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil that I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. So, after all that, he says, so I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being, I delight in God's law. But I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am. Who's going to rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature a slave to the law of sin. So after all that confession, basically, that Paul lays out there, that I'm sure every one of us can identify with, right?
Yes.
After all of that, the answer to his last rhetorical question when he says, who's going to deliver me from this situation? He says, thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. I'm glad that that was his conclusion after everything that he just laid out, right? And that there was nothing more than just that. Imagine if he had gone on to expound on that and had added other things, how much more confusing that would be. But to just, in summary, say, I am so glad for Jesus Christ, my Lord, because he gets me out of all this. Right? What do you think about this struggle? And there was lots of that I do's and that I do not do's in what Paul was saying. It's even a little tricky to read sometimes, isn't it? Because you got to make sure you get all those in the right place. But what do you think about Paul and what he was saying there in his struggle? Any thoughts on that? Mike?
Sounds like what I struggle with every day. And honestly, it's actually refreshing to hear the Apostle Paul talk that way, because when I think of giants in the Bible, other than Jesus himself, you think of the Apostle Paul, and you think of Peter, and John, Moses, Abraham, the list goes on, Joseph, but to read that and to realize that he struggles the same way I do, it's good to hear him say that thanks to Jesus that without Jesus he knows he's failing.
Right.
Same
Right.
here.
Yep. Yes.
In 2 Corinthians 10:5, this is like one of my strongest scriptures, and we try to live by this. Taking our thoughts into captivity to Christ. That's what I do. Every time I start feeling weak or, I get a sinful thought, that's what I do. And you know what? It works every time. I'm telling you, it does.
That's
It just...
and that kind of brings me to one of the things I was going to try to summarize about what Paul is saying here. If you notice his language, Paul says that the struggle that he really has is between what he knows and what he does, right? What he knows and what he does. And I have a slide that kind of summarizes that here in just minutes after this one. So Paul says, "For I do not do the good that I want to do, but the evil that I don't want to do, this I keep on doing." Okay? So if this is a situation that Paul is in, even now as he writes this, as a at this point in time in his life, a long-time believer, okay, well past the time when Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, he has established himself as an apostle. His teaching has, been all through the region. Even after all of that, he struggles with this. And here's kind of just a graphical sort of summary of what Paul's struggle was. Paul says his struggle was between his will and his actions. Okay? Between what he intended to do, but what he ended up doing instead. Right? And he says this is a struggle between being in the flesh and being free from sin. So remember, chapter 7 comes right on the heels of his whole discussion about freedom from sin. And that's why, again, this chapter is very challenging to theologians, is because he just established pretty strongly that we are free from sin. But somehow or another, sin is still influencing us. And so, that's why some theologians have thought, well, Paul's not really talking about himself here when he says I and me and the things I do. But it really is pretty clear, I think, that he really is. Because it is an ongoing struggle, and that's part of the point he's bringing up here. And this commentator that I'm using, these aeons that I've used to describe these two different scenarios that we live in, Paul says again here, it's a struggle between being in Adam and being in Christ. We are still in both of those while we're living out our lives. So it wasn't that we've been taken out of one stream of reality and dropped into another stream of reality where there's no influence from the other one. Right? It's a constant struggle that's going on. And that's part of the point that Paul is getting at here. And part of what he's wanting his readers to understand is it is a huge struggle. And, I don't think that he's trying to toot his own horn or anything here. I don't think he's trying to say that, look, even me, I struggle with it. If I struggle with it, then certainly you're going to struggle with it. That's not really where he's going, but I think you can sort of read that into this, that it is a constant battle that we're in. Okay. Now, when Paul wrote to the Galatians, and remember he had to write to several Christian communities about life in Christ, but when he wrote to the Galatians, there was a whole section of his letter to the Galatians that, if you look in your Bible, go to Galatians chapter 5, look in verse 13, and right above verse 13 you might have a little subheading that says Life by the Spirit. Okay? I thought this would be a good time to go and actually read this whole section of Scripture. Again, Paul's writing to a different group here, but they have the same sort of struggle. But part of what Paul is getting at is that being free from the law, and when we get to chapter 8, especially when he centers on being free from death, he's going to spend a lot more time on the fact that because we possess now the Spirit of God, we have life through the Spirit, right? This is a good summary, so it's a good kind of a connection between Romans 7 and Romans 8. So let's jump over to Galatians for a minute and read what he says here to them. It says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." Now, before I go on here, a couple things I want you to recognize in what Paul is saying here. One, it's very clear that he's writing to Christians here, right? Because he says, "You, my brothers and sisters." So he is writing to a Christian community here. In Romans, and part of what some theologians have thought is that Paul's comments there are not directly to Christians, but are an allegory about unsaved people and what they struggle with. Okay? But Paul is writing here to a group of Christians, and see right away, he says, don't use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. So there is still a battle going on with this group of believers. So this is perfectly in line with what Paul has said in Romans chapter 7. Okay? So he goes on to say, if you bite and devour each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Reinforcement again of what he's saying in Romans. The acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking, and envying each other. So even here at the conclusion of what he says here, when he says, since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. That sort of implies even there, right, that there is action required on our part in order to stay in step with the Spirit. Right? You ever tried to keep in step with somebody, especially somebody maybe whose stride is a lot longer than yours? You know, and if you have to keep in step with them, you got to struggle, right? Okay, you have to reach maybe a little beyond what you're naturally capable of. I remember, trying to keep in step with my dad when I was little, and he was just taking his natural stride, and it was taking a couple of mine to keep up, especially like if we're walking in the snow, right? Because I can see his footsteps. And as a kid, I wanted to put my feet in his footprints, right? But it was hard because he was so much bigger than me. Spirit is a lot bigger than us. It is a struggle to keep in step with the Spirit. But it is something that Paul says you have to try to keep doing, because if you don't, this other power that's at work in the world is going to be able to come into your life and undermine you. And as it's doing that, it is going to convince you that you're still safe, that you're still in control, because that is one of its key weapons, is deceit. Teresa?
Yeah, in Ephesians, I don't have my glasses on, I think it's 4:30, it talks about grieving the Holy Spirit. And, we could actually grieve, we have the Holy Spirit within us as a Christian, we could grieve the Holy Spirit, and that's scary to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So I try to avoid that if all possible.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, Jim?
The idea that we were talking about, when we commit sin, it's death, leads to death. I don't think they mean a physical death. I think they mean like a separation from God.
Yes.
And so that idea that, and if we do this wrong, we go by the rules rather than the Spirit, get it wrong, then our relationship with God will be separated. We'll think we're walking with God, and we won't be.
Right. Yeah. Any other comments here? I've shown before some parallels that there are between how Paul addresses these various powers that have influence over us, right? The wrath and sin and death and so on. Here's a couple other parallels I wanted to point out between chapters 6, 7, and then we're going to get into chapter 8, but I'm pulling a little bit from 8 back into this lesson for a minute. Paul says in chapter 6, we're free from sin, but we still have to battle against it all the time. If you remember the slides, but with the battlefield in the background, and the enemy lines and stuff, and we always have to fight. Chapter 7, Paul says we're free from the law, but we're not righteous according to its criteria. Okay? And that is part of the kind of the core thinking that he was having to combat when he was writing to the Romans, is because there was this culture, at least amongst the Jewish community in Rome, to fall back on the law and to rely on righteousness through the law. Okay, but Paul says we're free from the law, and we're not righteous according to what it lays out. We're righteous because of this free gift of God. In chapter 8, he's going to say we're free from death, yet we long for the redemption of our bodies, even though we can say already we're free from death. And that is part of the struggle that Paul is trying to also convey in chapter 7 when he writes, what a wretched man I am. Who's going to deliver me from this body? Because as long as I'm in this body, somehow or another, sin still has its talons in me. Okay, and whenever I want to pull free from it, it seems to be able to pull me back. Right? He wrote, the things that I want to do, the things that in my mind I know are right, and in my mind that's what I intend to do. I set for myself a course in my mind, and somehow or another, through my body, through the flesh, through the way that sin still has some leverage over me, I end up doing the thing that the exact opposite of what I wanted to do. Right? So it's a daily struggle, and Paul actually cries out wanting to be delivered from the body where all of that struggle occurs. So that's a kind of a glimpse into chapter 8 here. We're almost out of time here, and I don't have enough time to get through the rest of my slides on chapter 7, so we'll have to finish that up next week. But this commentator says here, in this present world we face the dualism and the tension in the Christian status. As a Christian, he belongs to Christ and lives life in Christ. But as one who belongs to the old aeon, he still lives in the flesh. So, I guess in summary for this week, something to remember, and somebody brought this up, I think it was Mike who brought this up. It's a blessing to be able to look at chapter 7 and look at Paul's struggle and to realize that we're all in this together, right? When you read what Paul wrote, and when you consider your own life, and when I consider my life, it's a blessing to me to know that I'm not the only one in the boat, right? We're all in the boat together, and Paul's in the same boat with us. This is a struggle that we all go through, and to me that's a blessing knowing that. Not a blessing that I'm subject to that, because I don't want to be subject to that, and neither did Paul. But since we are, and that seems to be something that we're going to have to fight against all of our lives, I am glad that you all are my fellow warriors. Because if it were not for you all, I would feel really, really overwhelmed. Rhonda?
I'm thinking that it seems like it's important to let new Christians know what their struggle is going to be, because I don't think that that's emphasized when they become a Christian.
Right. No, I believe you. I think that's very true. Yeah. For people who come to church for the first time, I think this is a cultural thing that actually works against us. The fact that we try to dress our nicest and behave our nicest and everything when we are in this building, just inside this brick and mortar structure here, I think that sort of works a little bit against us for new Christians, because I think that they think that there's a standard that even though they've come to Christ, that somehow they're still not quite meeting a standard. So I think you're very right. Yeah, I think that's something we have to work against too. Melinda?
I'm a new Christian, and at first I tried to do it on my own, to try to follow God and seek God's word. And I learned that what I have to learn how to do is to call upon the Spirit to lead me, and not try to do it on my own, because I will fail. But to constantly call upon the wisdom of God and the Spirit to help me. That was a really helpful thing for me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Oh, you got your Jay?
Yeah, I think she said an excellent word when she said failure. And I think one way that you can, really help newer Christians is to have them realize that that's part of the process. Failure is part of the process, right? Like,
Right.
You don't come up out the water. Even Peter said that, right? You don't come up out the water, and your flesh is completely clean. That's not how it works.
Right.
This is a process. It's a journey. It's like any other growing relationship. It needs to be fed. It needs to be nurtured. And it needs to be placed in an environment, ready for its growth. But failure, right? Even if you look at plants, right? Plants have to die. The seed has to die first so it's the same. Failure is part of the process. So I think just being upfront about that, because like you said, traditionally we indirectly or not set a standard that, like you said, people feel like they have to.
Right.
Like we're not failing anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's just that we know that's not the truth, but
Right.
sometimes that's how it can come off that
Yeah.
we have everything together, and since they know internally they don't, that barrier comes up. So I just think,
Right. Right, right. You know what thought came to mind when you said that was Thomas Edison, when he was trying to find the right material for the filament of a light bulb, and he failed so many times. And I don't remember the exact words, but somebody asked him one time, don't all those failures, isn't that overwhelming? Isn't that, depressing you? And he's like, well, no, now I know 1,000 ways that I don't have to try again, 1,000 materials I don't have to try. You'll have to look it up and see what his exact quote was, but he didn't view them as failures. He viewed them as lessons, right? Lessons learned. So. Okay, thanks everybody. I've kept you over a couple extra minutes.